There's an aspect of Frazer's work that is not normally dwelt upon, but I think it's important for the purposes that we have because we're going to be dealing with theories of comparative religion in increasing detail. And so what I mean to point out here is the notion of abstraction and how it is that from a series of data points, abstract some kind of similarity. Because for Frazer, the mechanism by which we should understand that his argument is convincing is the juxtaposition of a variety of data points, so a variety of stories put together, set next to each other, and we can intuitively see that those stories are similar in an important and substantive way. And so, while he may have something perhaps a bit more superficial in mind compared to later theories of mythology, especially I have in mind Levi-Strauss and others along the structuralist vein, because Frazer may want to point to specific rites and specific things that are very obviously common. So where you have a king whose kingship is sustained through combat, and that if someone defeats him in combat, they become the king, and so on. This is the kernel of the study that guides his whole project, ostensibly. So the garden at Nemi is presided over by a king. That king rules uneasily, he says, because at any time he can be taken out by someone who is stronger. And this is something that he finds in a variety of settings, and simply by virtue of having that kind of factor in common, we are to understand that there is some substantive similarity. So in other words, we take a very obvious, superficial, perhaps, detail that you have kingship, the kingship is passed on by way of this particular mechanism. If we find this in multiple places, then Frazer is going to be want to say that there is indeed a substantive commonality there, there's a real link, and that we should understand them as species of the same thing. Now, that may be right, but what I'm trying to bring to light here is the mechanism which in many ways lays implicit in what he's saying. And there's a key phrase where he describes it as a probable story. And it's something that I want to key on because we're going to encounter different versions of this. So, first of all, probable story is something that very likely harkens back to Plato. Plato spoke of a likely story in the Timaeus, in saying that he was giving a likely story because presumably proof was not an option, and it was something that was not so clearly and definitively decidable. But if one could give a likely story, then that was useful in a certain way. It produced a kind of understanding, catalyzed thought perhaps, and on. We can think of a variety of ways that a story can be useful without necessarily being absolutely true and definitively demonstrable in its truth. Now there's more to it than this because Plato's very account of truth helps us more in understanding the word likely there, because something that is true resembles the truth, and that thought is the truth and is a manifestation of it in a strong sense for Plato. In other words, if I have an idea of the truth, it's not merely, my little model off in, a corner somewhere that just happens to be similar to something that's true, but in fact there's actually a substantive link between the manifestation of a form, in this case, a manifestation of the eternal and the eternal itself. And so if it is similar to it, then there is something stronger than merely saying, well, it kind of looks like it. In other words, it has the hint of the whiff of truth in a strong sense. And this is something that would be developed eventually into the image of God concept in Christianity. This is something that's going to be latched onto, especially in patristics, and we'll get to that as we talk early Christianity, which of course was very heavily influenced by Plato and the Neoplatonists and the Middle Platonists. Nevertheless, likely story. So Frazer's probable story, his probable account, is one that we should understand as being intuited from, something that comes clear to us from seeing these stories juxtaposed. So you set a number of different stories of kingship passed on by this particular form of slaying the current king. This is something that we should understand as being clear, intuitively obvious by some kind of mechanism of abstraction. And what I mean by this is something similar to what William James described in terms of abstraction. And this is nothing more than saying, if I see a bunch of cats and I eventually learn that there is a single word that covers all of those different things rather than the individual names that they have, then I quickly abstract from that set of things that I know the term cat. And so that abstract term doesn't apply only to one or is not manifest entirely in any one of the individuals, but in fact applies to all of them. Now, this isn't something that we necessarily have to be given before. We don't necessarily have to be told, okay, this is pick your favorite 5 or 10 different cat names, and then say, okay, but they're all cats. We don't have to have this explained to us. In fact, when we see, and this is where James's insight is interesting, when we see related phenomena, when we see the same kind of thing happen, even just a few times, it doesn't take much. He says our mind thirsts for abstraction. And this is genuinely interesting because it points out a potentially rather fundamental thing about human psychology, in the sense that we crave abstraction. This is actually his phrase. We crave abstraction after being presented with only a few concrete examples. This is from his talks to teachers. And so when we're presented with Frazer's work and we see a number of concrete examples of myth, then we should keep this in mind, I think, and realize that when we see a bunch of these things set next to each other, we are naturally drawn to want to abstract and to want to find the commonality and to bring them all under a particular umbrella. So the will to abstraction, you might say, is very strong. And this, I think, that psychological fact helps us to understand why Frazer's work is so powerful. Because when he lays these things out side by side and we see these myths that maybe we're accustomed to hearing, I mean, we hear the Greek myths, versions of them all the time, but to see those set beside others that are very, very similar from cultures that we may not have heard of, and especially cultures that probably had nothing to do with Greece, had no contact with them, it's fairly convincing that there is something similar here. There is something intuitively to us, substantively similar. So we want to make that leap and say there is something substantively in common that we can find in what we're seeing. Now, two different things going on here, of course. We crave that abstraction, which tells us that we are naturally drawn to it. That's great. That's one of the reasons, perhaps, that Frazer's approach is workable for us and is powerful for us. That's one aspect of it, and that's good. That's interesting. But the second aspect, of course, is that we crave abstraction, and so we're naturally drawn to abstract from things even if we shouldn't. And so even in cases where we are presented with something that looks similar but maybe not really is all that similar, such as, for instance, seeing shapes in the clouds, or, and you can extend this, of course, to a variety of situations, people who see famous faces in toast or crackers or, some such thing. We are naturally inclined, strongly inclined, to see these similarities and to pick out similarities like this and to abstract from a small group of things that are perhaps in some cases only very loosely similar, even in situations where it clearly shouldn't be the case. Now, that last fact, I think, is something that really is valuable to keep in mind when we read Frazer's discussion of magic. So when we're thinking about sympathetic and contagious magic, his accounts of those phenomena and the stories associated with them spread throughout the globe. I mean, he has many of these stories, but I mean, you can just go on ad infinitum. I mean, this kind of stuff is everywhere in the anthropological record. And it's really interesting to think, what is the mechanism by which we find these things to be powerful? Because it's not just in what he calls primitive societies, traditional societies, but you find the same kind of thing happening throughout. In fact, one of the historical accounts that I read recently of medieval Christianity described the relic cults. So this is where they have, a particular bone of a saint or piece of clothing or, lock of hair or something of the kind. And this is enshrined and, people think that it has a certain kind of magical quality to it. And so they'll go and they'll pray to this particular statue for healing or for, whatever it is. I mean, this is fundamentally very similar to the sort of thing that we're seeing in the stories that Frazer describes. Now, I don't necessarily want to fully advocate his approach and say that this is exactly the same thing that's going on, because fundamentally he's going to come down very strongly on this and say, look, this is exactly the same thing. I don't want to be that simplistic about it, but I do want to point it out as a commonality and say, even unto modern times, these kinds of things, which frequently go under the heading of superstition, these kinds of things are still very much with us. There's no doubt about it. This is not saying anything either for or against the authenticity, but simply to remark that they're still here. And that much of what we're reading about in the earliest chapters of Frazer's chronicle of the history of magic, even pre-religion for him, even there, those same kinds of tendencies are clearly manifest in modern society. And it's something that perhaps we can even identify with in some measure. For instance, people who are accustomed to having lucky charms of a certain kind, a lucky shirt or a lucky whatever, especially if you play sports, it seems to be very common, then perhaps we can even look into ourselves and see what's going on. Is this a fault? Is it a mistake? Frazer's going to want to say, yes, it's a mistake. But should we be more careful? Is there something more going on? Is there something more subtle? And that's what I want us to have in mind as we're going through this. So, abstraction. This is definitely one of the topics that I want you to keep in mind. How does Frazer's presentation work? Why does it provide something that's genuinely valuable for us to study even a century after many of the theories and conclusions that are presented in it are no longer really taken very seriously? Why does the presentation of the material in this way still speak to us?